Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here with another Sunday session, and today we're going to be talking all about contamination on site and some of the things that you might need to be worried about. Everything from soil to contaminated water on site and a whole bunch more. Is it your site that is the cause of the issue, or perhaps a neighboring property that's actually impacting you? And what do you need to do in order to, one, identify it, and two, resolve it? Now, in order to help us to actually navigate this, we've got a very special guest, Costa Diomides from Diomides and Associates. Welcome aboard, mate.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for having us today.
That's okay. Now, mate, this is a topic that, look, a lot of people, I guess, I think, underestimate some of the impacts of, contamination on site, and they don't see the symptoms that should be triggering, their assessment. So we're going to deep dive into that. But I guess before doing so, just tell us a little bit about who is Diomides and Associates, and why are you the right person to be talking to, mate?
Okay. We're a specialised company. We specialise in soil and groundwater contamination issues. We've been operating for approximately 30 odd years. So we're fairly experienced, been doing it a long time. And we find that our clients always benefit from the work we do. So we always try and do the right thing by our clients to make sure they don't get stuck with contaminated sites that can cause them huge problems in the future.
Well, that's the goal every single time, I guess.
Yeah.
But what are some of the things? Oh, excuse me. Lost my voice a couple of weeks ago, mate, and it's still failing me from time to time. What are some of the different kinds of contamination that people may not even be aware of that actually exists? So kind of just rattle off a list of things that they might not even know about.
Well, it depends what the site history is, the site's been used for in the past. So if it's been used for a service station, there might be underground storage tanks. Mechanical workshops might use tanks for storage of waste oil and things like that. So that's always a big one. There's always asbestos in soil. Fill material that could be contaminated with industrial waste from any old industrial waste that's been brought onto the site many years ago. So they're probably the main things that stand out. And obviously there's visual signs of contamination in terms of stained soils and then of course odorous soils as well. So they're probably the main things that need to be looked out for.
Yeah, so we might kind of dive into, when somebody's, doing an initial site investigation, whether it be a paper-based due diligence or whether it be a site due diligence. What are some of the triggers, for want of a better word, that might raise the hairs on the back of our neck to say, hey, we probably need to do something about investigating this? So I guess probably the first trigger would be, whether or not there's some overlays that might actually call out specifically that it's a known contaminated land site, or there might be some other triggers that sit there from an overlays perspective. So what else to consider, mate?
Yeah, well, the main overlay would be an environmental audit overlay. So in cases where there is an audit overlay, the site would need to be fully assessed by an assessor, which is something we do. And then an EPA appointed auditor would then need to be appointed to audit the assessment work and issue, a statement of environmental audit or something like that. So that's one of the triggers. Council may issue a permit that has a condition saying that the site would require an assessment or an audit condition. So again, that's another trigger there. There may also be EPA notices that require you to do testing and cleanups and things like that. So that's another one. And there may also be a requirement from a contaminated sites register or something like that that suggests that there might be contamination on your site.
Yeah, and there's a contaminated site register in every single state. So you need to kind of find, your particular one but it's run typically by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority, for anyone who's not picked up what the EPA stands for. But that is
Yep.
really one of the first places to actually go, is it a known contaminated site? Because a lot of the time they've tracked a lot of that history that you're actually talking about.
That's right. But not all contaminated sites are listed on a register. So it always comes down to um, the developer or client doing what we would call their due diligence before they purchase.
Absolutely. And some of that due diligence, we're going to go, well, there's things to worry about when you are actually physically on site, and some symptoms that you might actually see that might trigger that. And then there's things that might be in the surrounding area that I guess may have in some way, shape or form leached onto your site. So let's look at site observations initially, mate. What are some of
Yep.
the things, if you're on site, some of the things that you might physically witness that might go, hey, that's something that I might want to, I guess, go and investigate?
Yeah, so things like tanks is what we mentioned before, underground storage tanks, above ground storage tanks, that may be for waste oil or fuels, or solvents. So
Would
that's
that
that's
also
probably the
include, I guess, the old septic tanks and that sort of thing as well?
possibly, but I mean septic tanks are organic matter, so they would break down over time. So it's unlikely they're going to cause a major issue, like like underground storage tanks that are used for fuels and solvents and things like
Yeah,
that.
but
So
if you see an
different kind of
underground
thing.
tank, you need to be suspicious. Is really the so it may or may not be a problem.
Definitely, yeah. If you see an underground storage tank, then it needs to be addressed as part of any development. It can't stay under a residential development, so yeah, it would need to be removed, and cleaned up if required. Yeah, definitely a
Yeah.
major trigger. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
So some of the other visual things I guess you touched on when we had our earlier chat,
yeah.
and even a little earlier in this discussion, but seeing a discolored soil, so just a changing of color, and I guess the darkening. What are the kind of the things that they would see in that discoloration that would stand out?
Well, obviously, it depends on the contamination involved, but if it's a hydrocarbon contamination, you might see like an oil stain or some dark material on the surface or below the surface even. Um, so they're the key things to look out for. Soil that doesn't look like normal soil, I guess, is the is the main thing there. But it could be different colors. It could be oily. It could be odorous. It's just depends what the contamination is, I guess.
Yeah, and when we say odorous, I guess not asking everyone to stick their head in it and sniff it, but is it something that is going to be obvious? Like if we're just standing there, we're going to notice that, or is it something where we actually need to take a piece of soil and actually bring it close to our face to kind of pick it up?
Yeah, quite often you might have to put it on a little spade or shovel and put it closer to your nose. If it's being disturbed, then it's more likely to release some of those vapors, and which will create the odor. So, yeah, if you disturb it a little bit, you're probably going to smell something if there's a significant odor there. Yeah,
Yeah. Another one that I guess contaminated fill that may have been brought onto the site. I guess when the original development was done way back in the day, it may have actually been filled. It could also
yeah.
be somebody who had an old pool that I guess they filled in, but they did it on the cheap and they didn't really get clean fill in. Those sorts of things, they stand out fairly regularly.
Yeah, yeah. They may have just brought in soil that was available nearby, and it may happen to be contaminated. It may have been from an industrial source, or may have building waste that contains asbestos or other materials in it. So, yeah, you have to be careful with where that materials come from, and obviously, if it's already there, then that's where some testing would come into play. So you know where you can take it basically if it needs to be removed.
Yeah, and the last one that I've come across way too many times is asbestos being buried on site,
Yeah.
um, uh, and I guess obviously asbestos is not used anymore, but back in the day, asbestos be used on one house being constructed, all the offcuts the builder would often take to the next site and then bury it before they, I guess, lay the slab on the next construction.
Yeah.
It was a fairly common thing back in the day. So sometimes you'll find it under the slabs, so you won't see it from a visual inspection until you actually demolish the house. Other
Yeah.
times it'll actually be in the dirt itself.
That's right. So yeah, again, you need to be careful with asbestos. It needs to be removed off site, and a hygienist is quite often required to do that kind of work, who's a specialist in asbestos removal.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that's all the things, I guess, from a site observations perspective. But then there's, I guess, adjacent uses. And when we say adjacent, it may not necessarily be the site next door, but it could be, I guess, in the near proximity. What
That's
are
right.
some of the things where adjacent properties may have potentially caused some sort of contamination that's leached into the soil or the groundwater,
Yep.
uh, that I guess might be a suspicious thing to go investigate?
Yeah, well, some industries like service stations, electroplaters, dry cleaners, so all these kinds of industries or former industries usually have underground storage tanks where they store fuels and oils and solvents. And quite often the tanks get old, they rust, and they quite often leak. And if they leak, that will eventually find its way into the groundwater, and because groundwater flows, it could end up under your site, even if it's a couple of blocks away. So that can be an issue if it creates vapors and things on your site. So they may need to be managed with vapor barriers or something similar, and that can obviously add cost to a developer's project. So
Yeah.
it's always important to look for surrounding issues, so that you know what sort of impact they may have on your development.
Yeah. So the other industries might be smash repairs, mechanical workshops,
Yep,
industrial manufacturing, gasworks, clothing and textiles. There's a whole bunch of things where all of that would happen. So
that's
I
right.
would say, as a broad generalization, if you are adjacent to an industrial precinct of any description, then it's probably I guess a I guess at least do a preliminary investigation to see whether or not there's any issue on site. Um,
Yep,
but but equally, sometimes those industries are sitting in the middle of nowhere or have been historically, and you may not even know, because that may have started up and then shut down, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but the remnants are still there.
that's right. Yeah. So yeah, you need to be careful with properties that can potentially impact the site that you're looking at developing. So yeah, that's always important, and it's always important to do your due diligence before you purchase the site, just so you know the site history, you know what your site's being used for, and you also get an idea of what some of the surrounding properties are being used for, just so that you can reduce the risk of some of these industries that are fairly high risk contamination sources that may potentially affect your development when it comes time to developing your own site.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I guess one of the reasons why that's super important, because as our cities are actually getting bigger, then there's a lot of what they call brownfield development, where the industrial precinct is now starting to be surrounded by residential, and they relocate the entire industrial precinct to the outskirts of the city again, and they redevelop, I guess, the original industrial precinct. And so you could be picking up, I guess, something that has been developed and used for many, many years with something that's contaminated, and be none the wiser, just because it's been rezoned. So I guess want to be careful if you're going into brownfield developments that you know about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's something you definitely have to do your due diligence with. Going in blind would be it can be very costly in the future. So it's best to have as much information as possible before you buy, so that you don't have these headaches later. once you started developing and can't complete the development because of, any form of contamination issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, now we've kind of found, I guess, the things that can get the hairs on the back of our neck standing up to go, okay, we're suspicious that something might happen. I would
Yep.
say alert but not alarmed is probably the first place to start.
Yep.
We want to, at minimum, during our due diligence, start to go, well, are my suspicions correct? So, what are the stages that we'd actually go through to actually try and understand? I guess one, is there an issue, and two, what is the, I guess, the impact of that issue?
Yeah. Yeah. So, Um, I would recommend that as the first stage of your due diligence, if you're buying a property, you might do this either before you sign up, or you might buy it subject to. Um, so you might do a preliminary site investigation, which we call a PSI, sometimes also called a phase one assessment. And that's usually your desktop assessment and includes a site inspection. Your desktop would include looking at, historical uses of the site and surrounding properties from historical directories. It would look at aerial photographs of the area, um, and it might involve speaking to previous owners of the subject site and maybe some of the surrounding properties if you're able to get onto those previous owners and occupiers. So that's the desktop component that would allow you to establish what the site was used for and what some of the surrounding properties were used for, so you can establish some kind of risk associated with those uses. So that's always the first stage of any due diligence. Uh, yeah, and it obviously doesn't involve any sampling. It's just a desktop and inspection at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you also get someone like yourself out on site to actually physically inspect as well? Like you said, maybe not doing the sampling per se, but maybe to look for some of those visual clues that your trained eye might pick up and my untrained eye might not.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, someone like myself would do the site inspection as part of the preliminary site investigation, and yeah, and we might pick up certain things. Like as an example, sometimes underground storage tanks get covered with concrete, which means you might not pick them up, but there might be a clue in that a vent pipe might be present, or an old base of a Bowser or something like that that you might not necessarily pick up, but we would hopefully be able to pick that up and tell you that that what it is and what it was used for in the past. So we've had that in a lot of cases where the client might not be aware of it, but it's fairly obvious to us because we see it all the time. So things like that are always something that need to be picked up in at the early stage. Yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of that process, I'm assuming you're going to give some sort of report with, I guess, regards to the risk rating or the observations and what you recommend for next steps. So,
Yeah.
so what
Yeah.
what kind of things would we expect in that? And give us some ballpark. What would it cost to do one of these PSI reports?
Yeah. Okay. So once we've done the site inspection and all the desktop, we've completed all the desktop information, we would write our report, which would present all that information. And at the end, it would have a recommendation as to whether it's, a low risk, a high risk, or, some in between risk based
Yep.
on the site uses. And would recommend that maybe some soil sampling or groundwater samplings is required as part of a detailed site investigation. So that would be the key recommendations of the report. In terms of costs, it's always difficult to put a fixed sort of price on these things. It'll obviously depend on where the site's located and I guess how difficult it is to do. So I mean, it could start anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 for a preliminary site investigation, but obviously it's just a rough ballpark.
Yeah, obviously
And
the size of the site and the likelihood of the contamination, all those sorts of things are going to be variables in that. But it
yeah,
gives
yeah,
somebody in the due diligence phase at least how much do I need to have as an at risk element to say, well, if I end up finding some negative results, that that 5K might be well spent.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, um, the experience of the person doing it comes into play too. So, if it's really cheap, then it's probably being done by um, someone that doesn't have a lot of experience, and then at the higher end, it might be done by a more experienced person. So that's always something you should look out for as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Now, subject to what we find in that particular report,
yeah,
I guess, as you said, could be low risk, and the recommendation might be you're okay. I guess keep on moving, or it might be, hey, we actually genuinely think there's an issue here, and we need to dive deeper. What is the next stage?
yeah. So the next stage would be a detailed site investigation, which would involve your sampling. So it may require soil sampling, or it may also require groundwater sampling. So we tend to. It depends what we've found with the preliminary site investigation. That would determine the scope of works for the detailed site investigation. So if we've found that a site was previously used as a service station, for example, then the detailed site investigation would probably include both soil and groundwater bores. So we would come out and sample the soils and the groundwater, and get them analysed for hydrocarbons and things that are relevant for service stations, and then obviously write our report based on what the results show. Yeah,
And I guess as a result of that, I guess like you said, groundwater and potential soil contamination side of things. Let's kind of dive into assuming that I'm going to go back a step. Sorry, I've gone too far.
yep,
Those soil samples, you're going to send them off to a lab, right? And
yep.
the lab is then going to assess those and actually, I guess, come up with their findings. What are the kinds of things that the labs? What are the kinds of tests that the labs would do?
Yeah. Well, the assessor would request the lab to analyze things for a certain suite of contaminants. So it depends what the issues are, but if it's a service station, you would be doing hydrocarbons, benzenes, and things like that. Perhaps lead if it's an older petrol station where they use leaded petrol. So these are the sorts of contaminants you'd be um, requesting the lab to analyze, and the labs would produce a certificate of results, and then the assessor would look at the results and interpret those results to see whether they're above certain criteria based on guidelines, and then they would um, come up with their conclusions based on that comparison with the criteria.
Yep. And so effectively, they're going to classify the level of contamination that actually exists in the soil, if it should be in the soil, for example. So, what are some of the classifications in here? And important to understand, folks, when we're talking about soil classifications here, we're actually talking about contamination classifications. We're not actually talking about, I guess, the type of soil type that you might use for your foundation. So, it's a slightly different outcome.
Yeah.
But what are the contaminant? What are the classification levels that you'd actually come up with?
Okay, so if we're talking classification, we're actually talking about if the soil needs to be removed offsite. So that's where you have your classifications as fill material, which is your clean material, and then you have your contaminated levels, which are your Cat D as the lowest. Then it goes up to Cat C, which are Cat D and C are similar, and you have your Cat B, which is your higher contamination levels, and then Cat A is the highest level, which needs to be, um, it can't be, it has to be treated basically before it can go to a landfill. So that's a more difficult one to deal with, but and a more expensive one to deal with as well. So the highest level obviously costs a lot more to dispose of. But in terms of classification, that's only for off-site purposes. So if you're doing an assessment, we would compare to the NEPM criteria to see whether they're within low-level residential criteria, or HILB would be for higher density, and then if it's a commercial use, then it would be HIL D as well for that as well. So it depends what you're talking about, whether it's going off-site or staying on-site in terms of what sort of classification you're talking about.
Which depends on what you're actually doing. For example,
Correct.
if you're building a basement, you're going to be, I guess, taking a lot of soil off of site,
Yeah.
and so I guess you've got to consider what that's going to be. If you're not building a basement, you might only be doing, I guess, some basic foundations. You might be leaving that soil on site. So understanding, I guess, one, the level of contamination, and two, I guess, the amount of dirt that you actually need to remove, I guess is then going to determine next steps. Now, you said an acronym there, HIL. What is HIL?
Oh, health investigation levels, which are part of the National Environment Protection Measure. They're the criteria that we use for, like HILA is the low level residential, HILB is for high density residential. So they're the criteria that we would be comparing to, so that we know whether they fall within the level, I guess the criteria that we need for low level residential or high density residential purposes.
Okay. So,
Yeah, and that would be, it depends on the development. So if the developer's looking at apartments, it would be regarded as a high density scenario. So you'd be looking at the HILB criteria.
yeah. So, okay. So we've got two scenarios. One, we're going to keep our soil on site, and two, we're going to take our soil off site. If we're going
Yeah.
to keep it on site, I guess at what point does it deem to be satisfactory and safe to actually stay there, and what point is it deemed that we need to do some level of treatment to the dirt, for example?
Yeah. Sometimes we would be looking at the criteria that I mentioned, so the HILAs and Bs, but it's not necessarily restricted just to a criteria. Sometimes you could do what's called a risk assessment, which means you plug all the information into a computer model, if you like, and it'll tell you whether those contaminants are an issue at a certain level, and they might be at a certain depth where they don't come in contact with people. So we quite often use what's called a risk assessment to see if it can stay on site or whether it is actually an issue and may need to be treated or removed off site. So that's usually the way we would work that. Yeah.
Okay, and so let's go the other way. Let's assume that it has to go off-site. What are
Yeah.
the, I guess, the different ways of actually treating this? So clearly, I guess taking it off-site and landfill is an option, but you can't just dump it in any landfill. Like what are the options to, I guess, take it somewhere and just leave it there?
Yeah, so if it is contaminated soil, then it has to go to an EPA licensed facility, and that could be a landfill. But these days we have a lot of recycling places as well that recycle contaminated soils. So they also need the EPA licensed facilities, but obviously we don't want soil going to landfill as much these days. So recycling contaminated soil is becoming a bigger thing these days. So it's something that we can look at as well. It just always comes down to, I guess, what's the more cost-effective way of dealing with these contaminated soils.
So this is probably it might be a play on words. I don't know here, but when we say recycling, when I think about recycling,
Mm.
the aluminium can or the plastic bottle is going to get repurposed.
Yeah.
Is it recycling or is it refurbishing the soil? Like do they pull the contaminants out and they repurpose the contaminants? What do we mean here by
Well,
recycling?
recycling could mean they might do soil washing, so they're treating it in some way, and then once they've got a clean product, then they can use that soil for another purpose. It might be thermal desorption, which is a process where they heat the soil to drive off hydrocarbons and things like that. So there's various I guess, treatments that can be done that will allow the soils to be recycled and be reused as clean fill if they get to that point, or if they're category A, and they might bring it down to, say, category C, and then it can go to a landfill if they can't get the contamination down to a low enough level. So they're just some of the ways that it can be recycled,
So,
basically.
so we're talking about recycling the soil, not recycling the contaminants in the soil. I thought there might be a way to pull that out and create some more oil or something like that. But
Yeah, unfortunately, not in that way. No.
all good.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then I guess there's also the option, I guess, but not a very commonly used option, and that would be to actually physically treat the soil on site. So why is that not commonly used?
it's a little difficult to treat soil on site. Sometimes for hydrocarbon contamination, you might stockpile the soil or spread it out a bit, and let the sun, if it's during summer or hot periods, you might let the sun sort of drive off the volatiles for hydrocarbons, and then you might mix it up and continue the process. But that's quite often a lengthy process, which might take all of summer or even longer to achieve levels that are quite low. So the main issue with doing on-site treatment is that you probably wouldn't have the space to do that on a small development site. So usually it would be a better option to send it off-site to some kind of recycling site, like one of the ones we've mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, which effectively means, depending upon how much dirt you actually need to be remediated and how much dirt you need on site, you'll need to excavate and, I guess, ship off site to either a treatment facility or a controlled landfill. And then you may
Yep.
need to then bring back in clean fill to replace that. Um, now, if it's getting recycled, that might take them 3 months, 6 months to clean that up. That might get
Yep.
repurposed for another site later on, but that's probably not going to come back to your site. You're
No,
probably
probably not.
sourcing other dirt. So you've got a cost for excavating. You've got a cost for, I guess, the remediation. You've got a cost for bringing in the clean fill as well.
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, you need to bring in fill that's preferably got a certificate saying that it's been tested and is clean, because you don't want to be caught, um, with soil or what's meant to be clean fill that ends up being contaminated. So you got to do your due diligence with any soil that you bring on site as well, and make sure that it is clean, and definitely not from someone that's just trying to get rid of some soil that could potentially have some issues with it.
Yeah, I see lots of times where people try to cut costs and get free fill because somebody might be excavating a pool or something along those lines, and they go, "Well, I can pick that up for free," but they
Yep.
don't go to the effort of doing the test, and sometimes they're silly enough to put an ad saying, "Fill wanted," or a sign saying "Fill wanted," and then people just come and dump uncontrolled fill on site. So be very, very careful. Don't do those things, folks. I would be the one. You go source the fill yourself. You test the fill yourself. Make sure it's actually going to work before you actually allow someone to just dump it.
Yeah, yep, definitely the best way to go about it. You don't want to have contaminated soil brought onto your site yeah, you don't want that kind of thing.
No. So that's the soil side of things, from a contamination for soil side of things. But you've also mentioned groundwater. Groundwater could also be contaminated.
Uh-huh.
Firstly, how do we actually assess, I guess, whether or not the groundwater is contaminated, and what are the treatment options for that? Because it's not quite the same as soil.
No. So with groundwater, we'd need to get bores drilled. So we usually would need a drilling rig to drill down into the groundwater, and they're cased with a plastic PVC piping. At the bottom, they have a screen that allows the groundwater to come through, and you would use micro purge pumps usually to sample the groundwater, and then send them off to a commercial labs like you do with the soil as well.
I think you said previously, I guess before coming on air, that you typically do a minimum of 3 bores. Why do you do that?
Yep, you typically do three because you'd want to know the groundwater flow direction, and that's to work out whether any off-site source could be impacting your site as a development site. So yeah, it's always good to know which way the groundwater is flowing so we can establish off-site sources.
Yeah, well, it's one, establish whether or not an offsite source is impacting you. So then you know whether or not your cleaning up is only just going to get worse again because the offsite source is still intact.
Yep,
Or two, maybe you're the one that's contaminating someone else downstream, and you probably need to be aware of that. And maybe your cleanup might not be limited to your site.
that's right. Yeah. Obviously, it's more difficult to clean up off-site because you might not have access to do that, but usually you'd be able to address if it's an on-site source, you'd be treating it on-site, pumping it out and treating it possibly on-site if there's space, or removing it through waste contractors and things like that. So
Yeah.
that's probably the way you would treat your groundwater.
Yeah, well, the groundwater, I'm imagining, is really the symptom. So we've got to identify what is the cause of that, and the groundwater is really capturing the symptom of that. So we've got to resolve what was the source, and then I guess then treat the water as well.
That's right. So if it was a former service station, they had underground tanks. The tanks have leaked. The hydrocarbons have gone into the groundwater. So that's established what's caused the source of the problem. And then addressing that might mean that the tanks need to come out. The soil might need to be removed or treated, or something along those lines. And then perhaps the groundwater might need to be treated with if there's a space, they might need an on-site treatment facility.
So with the groundwater treatment itself, Costa, I'm imagining that what we're going to have to do in order to treat it is we're going to have to physically, I guess, pump the water out of the groundwater itself until effectively it's empty. Do we then treat that on site or off site?
Yeah, if we've got space on site, sometimes the larger service station sites do have enough space. We can get treatment facilities put on site. They're movable ones, if you like, and the water can be extracted from the bores and treated on site, um, and it's usually treated with heat so that it drives off the vapors. So that way the hydrocarbon contamination is removed from the groundwater, and then that water can, if it comes up clean enough, can be possibly put back in the groundwater, or it can be removed off-site, possibly to sewer with trade waste agreements and things like that.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well,
Yeah.
I guess that's the soil, that's the water. I guess the only other contaminants that people are typically going to come across would be air pollutants.
Mhm.
In this instance, I guess that we've already dealt with I guess the source if it's on our site. If we're getting air pollutants from external sources, what are our options here?
If it's coming from soil and groundwater below the site, then we can use vapor barriers and things like that to prevent the vapors coming through the slab of the development that's being done. Um, in other cases, if you've got strong odors coming from your neighbour, then probably the only thing you can do is report it to the EPA and hope that they can address the issue in terms of the soil and groundwater contamination issues, so that they can reduce the odors coming onto your site. There's probably no other way to do it, unfortunately.
Well, I'd say, I guess the human touch is also worthwhile. Go and actually knock on the door next door and actually have a chat.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
but effectively, the source is outside of, I guess, your control. I guess whilst the air might be coming in your direction,
That's
it's
right.
really them that need to remediate that. And then, I
Mm.
guess, as a developer, you've got to work out whether or not the impact of that coming across, whether that's actually going to be a detriment to your site if they don't do anything about it, because it's possible that they don't. That's where reporting to the EPA might make them do something about it. But that you've got no control of the timeline. And in property development, timelines are super important to actually understand. By the time we finish our product and put it on the market, we're hoping like heck that process with the EPA has actually gone through and resolved the issue next door. So
Yeah,
I guess there's always a risk rating that would sit on it if it's an external source actually causing those things.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yep,
Very good,
yep,
mate.
yep.
Uh,
Probably not more I can add there.
no, but I guess again, alert but not alarmed. Make sure that we actually identify, I guess, the root cause of the challenge and go chat to them as the first thing. EPA
Yeah,
is
yeah,
kind of the second. So,
yeah,
mate, been a
yeah,
very
definitely.
interesting chat. Thank you very much for sharing your insights into all the different types of contaminants and the things to actually look for to identify that. What would be a tip or trick that you would want to give to someone if they have any suspicions at all with regards to, I guess, any contaminations on site?
Yep, I think the best tip I can give it is if you're looking at buying a property, it's always best to do your due diligence before you sign on the dotted line. So make sure you do your due diligence in terms of maybe doing a preliminary site investigation, work out what some of the risks are, and then you can possibly buy subject to or do the preliminary site investigation before you actually purchase is probably the best thing to do, so that you don't have any surprises down the track when you start your development. I think is the best advice I can give you.
Very good, mate. Been very, very informative. Thank you very much. Now, for anyone who wants to catch up with Costa, he is Melbourne based. And I guess, like him and all of our other industry experts, we regularly get them not just on these Sunday sessions, but we also get them to come to our regular monthly meetups that we run all the way around the country. So we run these in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide. You can turn up physically and you can also live stream no matter where you are around the country. So I guess if you're looking to get further involved in the property development game, highly recommend coming to one of those. Mate, thank you very much for our chat today. It's been very, very informative.
No
And
worries.
hopefully I'll get to see you at one of our upcoming meetups.
No worries. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.